There are certain truths too heavy to say aloud. They settle into the corners of our minds like old dust in an abandoned room, present but untouched, because to disturb them is to remember how long they've been waiting. Perhaps you felt it. That unbearable quiet in the space between what you show and what you feel. The aching realization that you could explain yourself for hours and still not be known. The way your thoughts echo through a room, unreturned, unanswered, unshared. Not because the world is cruel, not because people do not care, but because some souls are shaped in such solitude that language itself becomes a prison. Kierkegaard understood this silence. He did not write to be understood by the crowd. He wrote like a man speaking into a well, knowing the only voice he would hear would be his own, distorted, fragmented, swallowed by the depth. And yet he still spoke, because that is what the soul does when it is burdened by truth. What if you are not lonely because you lack connection, but because the connections you have cannot carry the weight of who you are? What if it's not about finding the right people, but about realizing that some inner terrains are so rare, so bruised by wonder and pain, that they have no roads leading in? You learn, slowly, painfully, to smile with your mouth while hiding with your eyes. You learn to nod at conversations that skim the surface, all the while drowning underneath in questions no one else seems to ask. You stop trying to be heard, because every attempt is like speaking a language no one recognizes. And then, the most dangerous thought of all arrives: maybe it's your fault. But it isn't. It never was. There are souls shaped by storms others never felt. There are minds stretched by absences no one noticed. And when you carry that kind of silence, the world seems impossibly loud, full of noise but devoid of depth. It isn't arrogance. It isn't superiority. It's a kind of mourning for a world that doesn't speak your dialect of pain. Some people are mirrors. Others are doors. But you were born as a depth no one ever learned to swim in. And in a world where everything is measured by how quickly it can be explained, how neatly it can be posted, how easily it can be digested, depth becomes a threat. So, you adapt. Not out of malice, but necessity. You learn to flatten your thoughts, dilute your feelings, conceal your grief beneath jokes. Because sincerity, in this world, feels like standing naked in a room full of mirrors. Too much, too raw, too soon. But you can only do this for so long. Because the self that bends too often to be accepted eventually forgets how to stand. That's what Kierkegaard feared most, not being misunderstood, but being reshaped by that misunderstanding until you no longer recognize yourself. And this, he said, is despair, not sadness, not even loneliness, but the slow erasure of one's essence. We want to be seen, not just looked at, but known in that unspoken, terrifying, miraculous way. The kind of knowing that makes words unnecessary. The kind of intimacy that feels like being read completely, gently, dangerously. But that kind of knowing is rare. And the deeper your inner world, the harder it becomes to open without shattering. Most people will not see you. Not because they choose not to, but because their eyes were never trained to recognize what doesn't shine, what doesn't sell, what doesn't scream. Kierkegaard walked through life with this wound. He knew his thoughts would outlive him. He knew his soul would be misunderstood. And yet he kept writing, kept reaching, not to be known, but because not writing was worse. Perhaps that's where meaning begins, not in being received, but in refusing to go silent. So you keep speaking. You keep creating. You keep loving, even if no one understands how you do it. Because the truth is, the more uniquely shaped your soul is, the fewer places it will fit. The more real your thoughts, the more alien they will feel. But this does not mean you are wrong. It means your frequency is rare. And in a world built on noise, clarity often sounds like silence. It's not that no one understands you. It's that few can. And maybe, just maybe, the tragedy and the beauty of your life is that you will continue to try anyway. There is a silence more painful than any scream. The kind that sits behind your eyes during small talk. The kind that walks beside you in crowded rooms. Not loud, not angry, just steady, unmoving. Like a shadow that no longer waits for light. It is the silence of pretending. Every day, you put on a face. Not because you are dishonest, but because you must survive. A face that nods at all the right moments. A voice that rises and falls with practiced ease. You laugh when required, pause when polite, conceal when necessary. You become fluent in the dialect of others, learning to echo, to mirror, to disappear. But inside, something watches. It watches as you offer fragments of yourself, piece by piece, only to see them misunderstood, reduced, repurposed. It watches the slow erosion of sincerity. Not all at once, but in tiny betrayals. In the smile that hides fatigue. In the yes that means no. In the I'm fine that swallows a storm. This is what Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death. A death that happens while you're still breathing. Not of the body, but of the self, the slow, invisible fading of who you really are, beneath the performance of who you must be. At first, it doesn't hurt. At first, it feels like strategy. You tell yourself it's just easier this way, that not everyone needs to know the truth, that fitting in is a skill, a kind of wisdom. But the self that bends too long to fit into shapes it was never meant to wear eventually forgets its original form. You wake one day and realize you've become fluent in everything except your own voice. Kierkegaard understood this ache intimately. He lived in a time when society was a theater, and he, with all his contradictions, all his longing, could not find a role that fit. He saw that the worst kind of despair wasn't being alone. It was being seen and still not known. Because to be misunderstood is painful, but to be applauded for a mask is worse. There's a violence in being reduced to what is easiest to explain. A flattening, a quiet suffocation. And the world rewards it. The world smiles at your convenience, not your truth. It applauds your normalcy, not your honesty. And so we trade fragments of our souls for applause we don't even believe. How many moments have passed where you could have spoken, but chose silence instead? How many times have you felt something real rising in your chest? A thought, a feeling, a confession, only to bury it beneath a joke, a shrug, a change of subject. Not because you are weak, but because you have learned that the world does not know what to do with realness. Realness is messy. Realness asks questions that don't have answers. It bleeds when touched. It shakes. It shivers. It disrupts the illusion of certainty that others cling to like a raft in open water. So we become polite. We become manageable. We become aesthetic. And the soul, once wild and full of sky, becomes a tenant in its own body. Kierkegaard wrote as though writing could rescue the parts of himself that were drowning. Every sentence he carved into the page was a rebellion against his own disappearance. He did not write for fame. He did not write to be liked. He wrote because not writing would have been another silence, another death. And maybe that's what we all need. Not solutions, not validation, but a way to scream without making a sound. To cry without needing a witness. To tell the truth without being punished for it. But the modern world has no patience for this kind of sorrow. It feeds on speed, on simplicity, on clear answers and bright screens. It wants you to be marketable. It wants you to be digestible. It wants you to smile, even when it's killing you. So we adjust. We edit. We curate. We reduce ourselves to highlight reels and one-sentence bios. We become legible, sellable, forgettable. And yet, somewhere, deep beneath all that performance, a voice still whispers. A trembling, stubborn voice that says, I am not what you see. That is the voice Kierkegaard protected. The voice he wrote for. The voice that, even now, speaks to anyone who has ever looked in the mirror and seen a stranger staring back. And the tragedy? We fear that if we were truly ourselves, we would be alone. But the deeper truth is this: we already are. Not because the world is empty, but because it is loud. Loud with expectations, with noise, with projections. And in that noise, the subtle becomes invisible. The strange becomes threatening. The deep becomes inconvenient. So we perform. And we call it life. But Kierkegaard invites us into a deeper terror and a deeper truth. That the only way to live without despair is to refuse the performance. To speak the unspeakable. To show the unshowable. Even if no one listens. Even if no one stays. Because to live any other way is not living. It is a slow forgetting. A ritual erasure. A smile stretched across a silence no one sees. And maybe that's the cruelest fate of all, not to be hated, not to be feared, but to be applauded for the person you never were. There is a point at which forgetting becomes easier than remembering. Not because the memories are painful, but because they no longer feel like yours. A childhood photo that resembles a stranger. A journal entry in your own hand that reads like fiction. The slow divorce between the self you became and the self you once were. And the world does not mourn this loss. No one lights candles for forgotten selves. There is no funeral for the person you might have been. No eulogy for the dreams too fragile to survive the cold. Instead, there is applause, promotions, compliments, smiles that stretch too wide across faces that do not see you. The world celebrates the version of you that performs, not the one that aches in silence. You become a structure admired from the outside. Glass walls, clean lines, and inside, dust. It's a beautiful ruin. Kierkegaard saw this architecture of disappearance long before we gave it names like burnout, imposter syndrome, or depersonalization. He walked through cities of people dressed in borrowed selves, men and women folded into social roles like clothes too tight at the seams. Elegant masks, polished smiles, and behind it all, dread. Unspoken, unseen, but not unfelt. It begins in childhood, with the first lesson in performance. Be quiet, be nice, be easy to love. And from that moment forward, you learn not who you are, but who you must become. The face begins to form early. By adolescence, it is almost complete. You smile the right smile, choose the right words, dress the right way. Your true self watches from behind glass, still breathing, still hoping, but fading. And society rewards this. Because a person disconnected from themselves is easier to manage. You go to school. You get the grades. You learn the scripts. You absorb the values. Success is measured in numbers, achievements, appearances, never in authenticity. Never in quiet. Never in pain. Eventually, you stop wondering who you are. Not because you found the answer, but because you've learned the question itself makes people uncomfortable. So you build. Career. Image. Identity. Brick by careful brick, you create a version of yourself that the world will accept. A self that fits, pleases, adapts. And for a while, it works. You are praised for your balance, admired for your strength, envied for your composure. No one sees the cost. No one sees the ghost sitting behind your eyes. Kierkegaard wrote that the worst despair is not to be broken, but to be perfect and feel nothing. The anguish of living is a masterpiece of survival, but a grave of self, a soul embalmed in societal approval. And yet, you keep going. Because to really stop, would mean confronting the emptiness beneath it all. And that is a terror most are not prepared to meet. So you keep smiling. You keep waking up. You keep performing. Until one day, you don't. Not dramatically. Not in collapse. But in small ways. You forget why you started. You lose the joy in what once moved you. Conversations feel hollow. Accomplishments echo with nothing behind them. You laugh, but it doesn't reach your eyes. You are not unhappy, but you are not alive. You have become a mirror, reflecting back what others want to see. And mirrors, though they shine, do not feel. This is the breakdown no one notices, because it is not loud. It is not public. It is not tragic. It is quiet, clean, and praised. But it is a breakdown nonetheless. In Kierkegaard, that old soul, torn between faith and dread, knew it intimately. He saw that modern life does not destroy us through chaos, but through order, through slow erosion, through the tyranny of the expected. Because a society built on appearances cannot tolerate truth. Real feelings are too raw. Real questions are too disruptive. Real selves are too wild to contain. So we suppress, we edit, we anesthetize, until even our own reflection no longer startles us. We no longer dream, we optimize. We no longer grieve, we move on. We no longer live, we maintain. And the soul, that old, trembling thing, is left to whisper into the void. But sometimes, in the silence between obligations, you hear it. A memory, a scent, a song from another life. A voice that does not belong to the self you show, but to the self you lost. And for a moment, you remember. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel the fracture. Enough to mourn what you've buried. Enough to know that somewhere, beneath the architecture of your disappearance, something still waits. Not for validation, not for applause, but for you. And if you listen, truly listen, you may realize that what hurts most is not being misunderstood by others, but forgetting the sound of your own voice. It begins as a flicker, not a revelation, not a breakthrough, just a slight discomfort in the performance. A word that catches in the throat, a gesture that feels unnatural, a moment of stillness between rehearsed expressions where something real tries to breathe. You don't call it anything. Not yet. It's too quiet for names. But it stays. It lingers in the mirror, in the pause after a joke that doesn't land, in the strange fatigue after smiling too long. It waits in the long showers, the solitary walks, the phone held in your hand while your mind drifts somewhere else entirely. Somewhere older, truer, closer to the surface than before. You try to brush it off, sleep it away, schedule it out, distract, scroll, polish the edges of the mask again. But the silence has learned to speak, and what it says is unbearable. It does not shout. It does not argue. It only reminds you of the one who used to dream without needing a reason, of the one who spoke in full sentences even when no one listened, of the one who felt joy without permission, of the one who cried without shame, the one who lived before the audience arrived. And you realize you miss them, not nostalgically, not with longing, but with grief, as if something has died and no one mourned it, not because they didn't care, but because they never knew it existed. Because you buried it in silence so early, so skillfully you almost forgot where the grave was. Until now. Kierkegaard called this the self calling itself back. Not through reason, not through logic, but through suffering. Through that deep ache that refuses to be medicated or explained away. That sacred unrest. The holy tremor beneath the routines. You feel it when your name is called, but it no longer fits. You feel it in compliments that slide off your skin, never reaching the wound. You feel it in moments meant to satisfy, and yet they do not touch you. You feel it, and you begin to turn. Not suddenly, not heroically. There is no music in the background. No one notices. It's just a subtle shift in direction. A half step inward. The first time you say no and mean it. The first time you admit, even just to yourself, that you are tired of playing the role. The first time you speak without adjusting your tone for someone else's comfort. Small things. But they matter. Because they're yours. Because they're true. Because they crack the architecture, even if no one sees the fracture yet. And it frightens you. Not because you don't want to return, but because you don't know who is waiting for you there. What if the self you buried has changed? What if it's angry? What if it no longer fits this life you built? What if it wants to burn it all down? Still, you listen. You listen through the fear, through the fog, through the rehearsed denials. And you hear something terrifying and beautiful. You are not this. Not just this. Not only this. And the walls that once felt safe now feel narrow. And the clothes you wore begin to itch. And the relationships that defined you begin to blur. And the mirror, once a confirmation of your success, becomes a reminder of everything that has not yet lived. Something is moving beneath the surface. Something is waking. Not an answer. Not a solution. Just a presence. A slow, undeniable becoming. And though you do not know what it is, it feels like home. And then it breaks. Not loudly, not with drama, but quietly, like frost thawing from a window at dawn. A slow release. A soundless collapse. You wake, and something has shifted. The script you used to carry in your chest has faded. The lines don't come as easily now. The smiles don't stick. The mask no longer fits. At first, it feels like failure. The world taught you to hold it together, always. To stay polished, composed, digestible. And now, the seams are visible. Your gestures stutter. Your thoughts wander. You weep at strange moments. You forget how to explain yourself. You are unraveling. And somewhere deep inside, a voice sighs, finally. You don't remember when you first picked up the weight. You only know it's always been there. Expectations, projections, identities you wore like second skins. The good one, the smart one, the strong one, the likable one, the one who never says no. the one who stays. And you stayed. You stayed long after the joy left, long after the light dimmed, long after the soul began to whisper, then scream, then finally went silent. You became what they needed, what they loved, what they expected, and little by little, you disappeared inside it. Until now. Now, the shell is cracking, not because you are weak, but because the truth has grown too large to contain. You can't pretend anymore. The compliments that once felt like water now burn on contact. The roles that earned you praise now feel like chains. The applause, once intoxicating, now echoes back at you, hollow, dissonant, unreal. What they love is not you. It is a version of you sculpted by fear. And fear is no longer enough. You look at your life, and it feels unfamiliar. Beautiful, perhaps. Well-crafted, certainly, but not yours. A house built with care for someone else's soul. Every object in place. Every detail correct. And yet the silence inside it roars. You realize you have become fluent in abandonment, but only of yourself. Kierkegaard called this despair. Not sadness, not sorrow, but the sickness of forgetting who you are, of becoming other than yourself so thoroughly that the return feels like resurrection and crucifixion. You do not rise as you were. You rise shattered, frightened, unfinished, and finally honest. Because once the illusion cracks, it cannot be rebuilt. Once you taste truth, even in small drops, the hunger becomes unbearable. You can't go back to pretending. You can't go back to being palatable. You can't go back to hiding your soul behind politeness and posture. You are done performing, not in rage, not in defiance, but in grief. The grief of years spent smiling when you wanted to scream. The grief of swallowing every no that trembled on your tongue. The grief of bending your body, your words, your light, just to fit into places that were never meant for you. And perhaps the hardest grief of all, the grief of knowing no one forced you. You chose this, or something inside you did. Some old instinct, some learned shame, some belief that you were too much or not enough, and so you began to vanish by inches. But you are here now, unmasked, unmoored, uncertain, and yet, for the first time in what feels like years real, there is no map for this part, no structure, no lesson, only breath, only silence, only the slow, aching task of learning how to inhabit yourself again. You stand at the ruins of your former self, and for once, you do not rush to rebuild. You let the dust settle. You let the walls fall. You let the echoes speak. And in the stillness, you hear a voice you thought you had lost. Yours. Not loud, not wise, just alive. It does not offer answers. It does not promise joy. It only speaks one truth. The truth you have avoided, feared, longed for. You do not need to be understood to exist. You do not need to be perfect to be whole. You do not need to be easy to be loved. And in that moment, something inside you softens. Not the pain, not the past, but the need to carry them alone. You begin, not with triumph, but with release. The surrender of trying, the exhale of pretending, the quiet rebirth of simply being. And it is enough. There comes a point when even the questions fall silent. Not because they've been answered, but because they no longer need to be. You wake, not into certainty, but into presence. The air feels heavier, but not oppressive. The light moves differently. Time does not press against you with its usual urgency. You move slower. You speak less. You notice more. And somewhere between the breath and the stillness, you realize you are not waiting anymore. Not for validation, not for clarity, not for someone to see you and make it all make sense. You are simply here, and that is enough. Kierkegaard never promised peace. He did not write for comfort. His truths were not warm, they were honest. His words did not wrap the reader in safety. They tore the curtain from the stage and revealed the hollow scaffolding beneath the play. But beneath that collapse, beneath that terrible exposure, was something more sacred than resolution. There was being, not being as role, not being as expectation, not being as reflection, just being, like a forest that grows in silence, unnoticed by the world. like a river that carves its path without needing permission, like a sky that changes moment to moment without apology. There is nothing spectacular about this state. No grand revelations, no cinematic realizations, just a quiet truth settling in the body. You do not have to become anything else. You do not have to fix yourself before you are allowed to live. You do not have to explain your ache before you are allowed to feel it. You do not have to justify your depth to those who have never been asked to question their own. And in this stillness, you begin to soften. Not break, not bend, just soften. The armor falls away, not in pieces, but in dust. The voice you carried for others dims. The need to be impressive, articulate, composed, slips out of your hands like sand. And what remains is small, but alive. You do not perform happiness. You taste it, like rain on your lips. You do not announce healing. You notice it, in how your body no longer flinches when your truth is near. You do not seek meaning. You walk beside it, quietly, like an old friend who does not need to speak to be known. The world continues. As loud as ever, as hurried, as hungry, it still demands faces, speeches, beautiful cages. But you no longer enter the stage. Not out of pride, not out of fear, but because you have remembered the cost of forgetting yourself. You are no longer a character in someone else's story. You are the stillness beneath the plot, the breath between the lines, the silence that does not need to be filled. And maybe that is enough. Maybe being cannot be taught, only remembered. Maybe the soul does not shout, it waits. And when you are finally quiet enough, it speaks, not in words, but in being. And that is where you remain, not resolved, not complete, but real.